Well, welcome. I'm really glad everyone's here. My name is Christina Williams, and I'm just excited to be here and have the opportunity to share this class. So this class is called Impact the City, and there's going to be two different components. So there'll be the Thursday night class, so what we're doing right now, and then for 2 more weeks after this. And in this class period, we're going to be talking about different social, cultural factors that influence our ability to engage with people and to impact our city. And so we're focused today kind of mostly on background material, kind of a lot of historical information about how the church has engaged with society in the past, fast forwarding to what the American church has done, and then looking at where we are today as the church here in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Next week will be more about understanding, so we'll dig deep, kind of gaining a deeper understanding of poverty, more than just kind of the material aspects of poverty that we sometimes think about, and talk about the ways that systems and structures kind of create and perpetuate injustice, as well as kind of moving past this idea of maybe just handouts or relief when we talk about outreach and engagement. And then week 3, we'll get to the question, what do we do about it? Talk about culture, how we can be innovative in the ways that we impact our city, and to use the gifts and the things that God's given us to be creative cultivators in our culture and in our city. So the second component is the city engagement component, and we'll talk more about that at the end of class today. But as we talk about engaging, we also want to go out and gain some exposure to what's going on in our city, some tangible things based on what we're talking about. So each week is going to kind of build on the next, and we are filming and recording it, so if you aren't able to come to next week for some reason, you should still come to the third week because we'll post that for you. But I hope you'll be able to attend for all 3 weeks, and I hope you'll be able to do the city engagement part as well.
Christina, can I interject real quick?
Yes.
If you guys miss for any reason, please don't. But if you do, you can email equipclass@gmail.com, equipclass@gmail.com to get a copy.
Okay, so I want to give you just a little bit of background on me and why I'm here teaching this class. So first of all, I'm married to TJ Williams, he's in the back, and he is a worship leader at New Heights and also runs a music venue over at Mama Carmen's. And we've worked together on this class. And he was very adamant he did not want to be up here, but he was very instrumental in talking through this material and figuring out a lot of this, like, what do we do about it? So he's also going to be helping with the city engagement aspect. Also, I'm a researcher. I lead the research team at a company called Field Agent here in Fayetteville. I do market research. So I like to ask a lot of questions and understand things. I like surveys and numbers and statistics. But more than just that, I like to understand like the insight behind it and how do we apply these numbers and statistics that we read. And I also work for a company called Join. And I know a lot of you may have heard of Join before. But it's a company founded by Mel and Dave Murray, who are from here in Fayetteville. And they founded it over in Dehradun, India. And it's a company that makes fashion products, so like bags and scarves. You may have seen some over in Mama Carmen's, the mustache, things like that. And they've worked really hard to provide jobs for local artisans over there to help pull people out of poverty and to engage in community development work. And so I've worked for them for a little over 3 years now. Stateside, and I'm managing their finances. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about Join later on tonight. And finally, and I think most relevantly for this class, I'm a sociologist. So I received my bachelor's in sociology at Furman University, and most recently got my master's in sociology at the U of A. And sociology is kind of this social science discipline that a lot of people don't really know exactly what we do. We kind of get lumped in with social work or psychology, but where psychology kind of focuses more on the individual and what's going on in the mind or psyche of the individual, sociology is about studying behavior at the group level. So differences between race, ethnicity, class, gender, generations. So an example of a question a sociologist would ask would be, what are the differences in parenting styles between middle-class parents and lower-class parents? Or how has the transition to adulthood changed? How does it look different for this generation versus their parents' generation? And why does it look so different? So more specifically than even just sociology, I'm a Christian sociologist, which means that I look at all this stuff that's happening in society, this sociological insight from a biblical perspective, which is something that hardly any sociologists do. So a large part of this class is going to be bringing together the theology and a biblical perspective with this sociological insight about what's going on in our country and in our city. Okay, so we're going to dive in now. Impact is part of the name of the class. What does it mean to have an impact on something? Really, what does it mean? You can shout out into answers. Change. What else?
Influence.
Yep. Yeah, so that something that you're doing, or maybe even not doing, is having an effect. So you can have a positive impact, you can have a negative impact, but there's some sort of action or maybe inaction that's taking place. So one of the primary goals of this class is to talk about how we as Christians, as messengers and witnesses of the gospel, can have an impact on our city. And more specifically than even that, how we can be purposeful in the way that we impact, in the way that we engage. So to talk about that, I want to first set the stage. So looking briefly at kind of the state of the church in America and views of the church's involvement in outreach and engagement. So without even looking at any research or statistics, I think we can all probably say that there's kind of this feeling, sense right now that things are changed in our country and that things socially and culturally are changing really fast, perhaps even faster than we can keep up with. We think about America and where it's been, we would often even say, okay, America is a Christian nation, right? Maybe. So what's happened? So these feelings, where are they coming from? If you're on social media at all, and look at Facebook, for example, I'm sure you've seen things like an open letter to the church, or 15 reasons why I left the church, or 10 reasons why, how the church needs to become more relevant, right? So these things alone out there are kind of saying that there's this indication that things have changed and that there's this level of unsettledness right now. But what does the research show? So a really good book that's recently come out, kind of talking about the state of Christianity in America, is this book called Churchless by the Barna Group. And if you're not familiar with the Barna Group, it's kind of this premier research group on anything and everything about the church and Christianity in America. They've been doing research for decades, so much so that we can now look back and kind of compare, see where things were compared to where they are now. And so one major statistic that they document here is the rise of churchlessness in America. The churchless being people who have either never gone to church or people who were once active in church but no longer are. And so they show that in the 1990s, 30% of the adult population in America was considered churchless. 10 years later, we see this number creep up to 33%. But then we see in 2014, this number is now at 43%. A much larger increase in the last 14 years than we saw in the 10 years prior. So this statistic is showing, okay, let's zoom in actually first. So if we zoom into 43%, we see that 10% of that is made of what they call the purely unchurched. So these are people who don't currently and have never attended church in the past. 33% of that is what they call the de-churched. So those are people who were once active in the church but now no longer are. So what this is showing here is that there are significant amounts of people leaving the church. So these changes that we kind of sense and we feel, like they're backed up by the research. Like this shows that it's really happening. And so the question that likely comes to mind then is, okay, why? Why is this happening? And there's some good resources on this if you're interested in digging deeper into this question. So there's a book called Unchristian, one called You Lost Me, and then Churchless. All these have been put out by the Barna Group as they've done all this research over the years. But one compelling finding that I consistently come back to as I think about impacting the city and how we do that and what are we even trying to do, is about how those outside the church view the contributions of Christianity in America. Okay, so listen to this. When those outside the church were asked to describe what they believe are the positive and negative contributions of Christianity in America, 49%, almost half, could not identify a single favorable impact of the Christian community. So if we go back to this word impact, this statistic suggests to me that the impact the church is having, or maybe should be having, is not readily evident to those outside the church. They can't see it. And so I know maybe what some of you might be thinking, like, I go to a really good church. Like, we do a lot of great things, and I know other churches out in America are doing really great things too. But this statistic right here isn't saying we're not doing good things. It's saying that people in society can't see them. So like I said before, I'm a researcher, so I ask a lot of questions. And the questions to me that come from this are, well, what type of impact should we be having? And what has happened so that this impact isn't as evident? And what should we do about it? So to talk about the type of impact we should be having, we're going to kind of lay a foundation for this class and start really big picture. In Genesis with the fall, and quickly work our way forward to where we are now as Christians in Fayetteville, Arkansas in 2015. So we know from Scripture that our God is an inherently relational being, that there's a relationship inherently in the Trinity, and we also know that God created us as humans in His own image. Therefore, we are also relational beings. When Helping Hurts is a good book that I'm going to be drawing a lot from. Who here has read that book before, or at least parts of it?
Who wrote it?
Two people that I'm blanking on their names. It's in my bag. I'll look after. But in this book, among a lot of other books look at this too, but they identify 4 foundational relationships for us as humans. So there's the relationship between us and God, the relationship with self, with others, and with the rest of creation. And this kind of shows us the ideal of right relationships, the way God created them to be. But as we all know, the fall really did happen, and things on this earth are not the way they're supposed to be. So what does this mean? It means that all of these relationships are in some way broken for everyone and everything. The fall means that this relationship between us and God is broken, that we're separated from God. And even as Christians who know and love Jesus, we don't get to daily walk with Him like Adam and Eve did when they were in the garden. And the relationship with ourselves, that there's brokenness, and we struggle to nurture and care for our own bodies, often doing things that are destructive, so like destructive sin patterns and bad habits, and living in ways that are psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually unhealthy. There's broken relationship with others, that we struggle in the way we relate to and treat other people. And there's also a broken relationship with the world around us. We know that the earth was cursed and even works against us. Do you see that? Do you sense that? You just feel it when you live your life? I mean, we know it intellectually because of the book of Genesis, right? But even non-Christians can sense it and feel it. So there's philosophers and scholars out there that as they do what they do, they like notice what's going on with this brokenness, that the world and the state of humanity just seems off. They use words like alienation from self or estrangement from others to kind of capture this brokenness that they're experiencing in the world. And so as humanity continues to function out of these broken relationships, we continue to perpetuate more brokenness. And the systems and structures that have existed for decades and that we continue to create are inherently flawed because of this. So in all this brokenness, we see Jesus as the healer and the redeemer and the reconciler of broken relationships. Meaning that he's come to put us back into right relationships with our Father and our families and our community, with ourselves and with the world that he created, and the way he intended it to be. And so I want to focus real quick on this word reconciler, this idea that Jesus came to mend, to fix the brokenness in our relationships, to restore these things that were broken. This verse in Colossians says, "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through his blood shed on the cross." So reconcile all things. And the context of these renewed, reconciled relationships is the kingdom of God, the kingdom that Jesus talks about over and over again. So Matthew 9:35 says, "Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness." So Jesus talks about spreading out this culture and this kingdom built on a new way of life. And it's a life that he modeled for us when he was here on earth. And so the Gospels provide us with a look at both the words and deeds of Jesus. So we see that Jesus not only spoke of healing, he actually healed every disease and sickness. And he not only spoke of forgiveness, he forgave, and forgave some of the most significant sinners in his society. There's this really fascinating verse in Luke. So in Luke 7, we see John the Baptist, who's in prison and was kind of on the path to eventually be beheaded. But he sends messengers to Jesus. And he tells them to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And if you think about John the Baptist, this is the guy who baptized Jesus. So he was there when God said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." So maybe he was having some doubts. Like, okay, that's understandable. But what does Jesus say in response to this question? He says, "Go back and report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cured. The deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me." Isn't it interesting that in his answer he pointed to the way that his actions supported what he was saying? That he was using both word and deed. And so what does Jesus say for us as the church to do? Simply put, he calls the church to be like him. So again, the book When Helping Hurts says it really well. It says, "The task of God's people is rooted in Christ's mission. Simply stated, Jesus preached the good news of the kingdom in word and deed. So the church must do the same. And Jesus particularly delighted in spreading the good news among the hurting, the weak, and the poor. Hence, it's not surprising that throughout history, God's people have been commanded to follow their King's footsteps into places of brokenness." So, if we look at the early church then, we see pretty compelling evidence of how they were living out the mission of Christ in both word and deed. So we know from Acts that the Holy Spirit was working powerfully in and through the church, and that it was adding to their number daily. And the gospel was being shared and spread. We also can see, though, that if we look at historical evidence, that the way the church lived and engaged with those lesser in society was countercultural and had a profound impact on the Roman Empire. So as in most large urban cities, there was a lot of social problems in the ancient Greco-Roman cities. So they had homelessness and poverty and public sanitation problems, high rates of crime. So you often see high rates of crime when there's a lot of population turnover because people are coming in and out. And those bonds of community, social solidarity, that kind of protection you get from just knowing people that you live around is not often there. And so you actually see higher levels of crime and disorder. And so this was kind of true in this culture as well. So we can see from historical records that early Christians were generous to the poor and the homeless. They provided community to newcomers and strangers coming in and out of their cities. They provided family to the orphans and widows. They took care of the unclean and the sick. And they welcomed in those that society shunned. The teachings of Jesus dramatically alter social and cultural relations. So you can now have a slave and a noble, and they can greet one another as brothers in Christ. And women were given higher value and status in the church than they were in Roman society. We can read stories about how the Christians went to the slave, they went to the temple prostitute and preached the gospel, told them about Jesus, and told them that they could be born again. And Christians valued life in a way that was foreign to the Greco-Romans, who had this cruel love of death. I mean, if you know anything about the Colosseums and arenas, the lions, the fights to the death, the gladiators, it was gruesome. Okay, I tried to Google it, and this is like the best picture I could find because they were all so gruesome, even in their drawings. It was really, really graphic. And there are other cultural practices of the Romans. Infanticide was regarded as reasonable and commonplace. So the great philosophers Aristotle and Plato, they actually recommended infanticide as legitimate state policy. And so you see a lot of evidence of drowning babies or leaving them outside when they were female or when they were deformed or a weak male. So this kind of shunning disability and not valuing that. But Christians came in and counterculturally viewed this as murder. But they didn't just label it as murder, they actually did something about it. They took them in, they raised them. A kind of modern day example of this, if you've seen the movie The Dropbox, it makes me think of that. Like that's what I picture them doing. They welcomed in pregnant women who would have otherwise been forced to get abortions. So they would make women take poison to kill the baby, which would usually end up killing the woman as well. And we see documented over time, actually, that there's way more women in these Christian communities than there were in these Roman communities. So it actually got off balance in society because so many women were gravitating to the church. And the kind of growth that was seen in early Christianity has really baffled sociologists and historians, that this tiny movement grew and completely dislodged classical paganism, which was this kind of catch-all universalist religion that actually banded this whole Roman Empire together. And you see Christianity eventually become the dominant faith of Western civilizations. So when talking about this explosion of early Christianity, there's a really great quote by P.R. Glover in his book, The Jesus of History. He says, "The Christian outlived the pagan, outdied him, and outfought him." And this is a pretty compelling quote. We also see historical evidence of this outliving the pagans. So a letter from Roman Emperor Julian writing to a pagan priest, he says, "The impious Galileans," referring to the Galilean Christians, "support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us." So to kind of reiterate here, the early church lived out the gospel message in both word and deed. And what I just showed was a lot of examples of that deed. And so I'm not trying to paint the early church as perfect by any means, but we do see that they engaged the poor and the marginalized in a way that was countercultural, was noticed by their society, and had a profound impact on the Roman Empire. Okay. So at this point in the class, I've kind of painted this broad picture of where we've come from. And now I want to fast forward a lot in history to the church in America. If we look back in the history of America, we see a lot of evidence of the impact evangelical Christians had on society. We see it in the areas of working for the abolition of slavery, prison reform, humane treatment of the mentally ill, fighting for improved working conditions for industrial laborers, or to get rid of child labor. Evangelical Christians started organizations like the Salvation Army. This is an organization that their mission here is to bring salvation to the poor, destitute and hungry, by meeting both their physical and spiritual needs. And the YMCA, which is an organization targeted towards men who were spending time in brothels and drinking a lot. And this was supposed to be a way for them to have healthy community and be healthy in their mind, body, and soul. And the American Missionary Association, which was an abolitionist group founded in 1846 with the main purpose to abolish slavery, educate African Americans, promote racial equality, and promote Christian values. So Christians also started orphanages. They started places for people to come and find employment. And then a whole lot of other things for the lower class, the immigrants, and other marginalized groups. And many of these organizations, if you start studying them, you'll see that they were started because Christians were out in society. They were seeing this need firsthand. However, something changed in the early 1900s. Among some Christians, the focus on social activism and awareness started to replace this biblical concern for the spiritual needs of people. We started to see these Christians lose this importance on the vertical relationship between man and God. Instead, this belief that eradicating the world of injustice and social evil was this primary purpose, primary concern. And this kind of view took over that this could even potentially be accomplished before the second coming of Christ. So this was later termed the social gospel movement. As a result, we see evangelical Christians intentionally and deliberately work to distance themselves from the social gospel movement. We see evangelicals pull back from social activism and shift inward, with this primary purpose being put on personal salvation, personal conversion, and what's often known as soul winning. So they took the position that the primary purpose of Christianity was to save souls, not society. And church programs and organizations and even our overseas missions all started to be directed towards this goal. So you see a lot of emphasis start to be put on personal conversion and these mass revivals. The shift in this evangelical focus was so great that it's become known as the Great Reversal. And not great because it was awesome, great because it was significant and huge. And I want to insert here that I am an evangelical. So I'm actually going to start saying we when I say evangelicals instead of they. So when evangelicals did focus on social reform, it tended to narrow in on issues that could be easily linked with personal vice. So this personal moral behavior. So you see a lot of focus on alcoholism, so a push for prohibition, or focus on banning books with obscenities and profanities, or other areas like abortion, focusing on abstinence and no sex. And not that these aren't legitimate social issues, because they are, but there were clear blind spots to other social cultural issues. And specifically, issues where we see groups of people being oppressed, or places where we see injustice on a large scale, where injustice seems to be kind of built into systems, structures that are continuing to be perpetuated. And since we took the view that all social problems are at root personal problems, we believe that solving these personal problems by correcting these personal, moral, immoral issues would, specifically by converting people to Jesus, would resolve those social problems in the world. Other areas of social kindness seemed to some to just be a way to get people through the church doors. So this kind of bait and switch method. And some evangelicals even took this position that it was actually good that society was getting worse, because it was going to get worse and worse until the second coming of Christ. Basically what this did was reject any kind of social responsibility for the here and now. And so just a reminder that I'm painting broad brushstrokes here. I'm not saying that this is every evangelical or every evangelical church. We're talking big picture, the trends that happened. So we see the social gospelers on this side accuse the evangelicals of inaction and of not loving people, while the evangelicals accuse the social gospelers of placing salvation as secondary to physical and social needs. It became very polarizing with this false dichotomy that the Christian message was either personal or social, spiritual or physical, this world focused or other world focused, not both. And each side accused the other of not being true to the essential nature of Christianity, the things that Jesus did and said, the way God is, of being hypocritical, and each side pointed to evidence they found in Scripture to support their point. But the reality is there are issues on both sides, with neither being fully scriptural. So one reason I wanted to cover this part as we're talking about engaging the city is that there is sometimes this tendency as we step out and talk about social action and social engagement to be kind of, for some people to come and be like, oh, that's social gospel. We need to focus on spiritual needs. And that's true. We do need to focus on spiritual needs. But I wanted to paint this picture that it's not this either or, and that this is kind of historically how we got to this place where it seems sometimes like it is either or. So remember what we talked about at the beginning. Looking at how Jesus lived, looking at what the early church was like, and even early Christianity in America. The importance of word and deed. But since the Great Reversal, evangelical Christianity in general has become very lopsided. And so again, if we look at what those in our society think of Christianity and the church in America, it shouldn't be surprising what they're saying. One of the chapters in the book Unchristian is called Get Saved. And so this is a book about what those outside the church think about the church. And so I think as we kind of go through some of these things, maybe this is not you exactly, but this is, again, the church. And so I think we need to hear these kind of things. So this one is Get Saved. And the quote here says, Christians are too concerned with converting people. They're insincere. All I ever hear is get saved. I tried that whole Jesus thing already. It didn't work for me before, and I'm not interested now. So the perception here is that Christians are insincere and concerned only with converting others. Do you see maybe where this is coming from now? Here's another one. hypocritical. The quote says, "Everyone in my church gave me advice about how to raise my son, but a lot of times they seem to be reminding me that I have no husband, and besides, most of them were not following their own advice. It made it hard to care what they said. They were not practicing what they preached." And so here the perception among the unchristian churchless is that Christians say one thing, but live something entirely different. That our deeds don't match our words, and our lives don't match our beliefs. So if we're supposed to be like Jesus, we need to say and do the things that Jesus said and did. In Luke 4, we see Jesus as prophesied in Isaiah and simultaneously see him describe what he came to do. So Luke 4:18 says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So for TJ and I, this verse has been really profound because we really desire to do the things that Jesus is talking about in this verse. So if we look here in our city, in Fayetteville, or maybe even the broader Northwest Arkansas, we can see, and I truly believe, that God has done some really great things and is still doing some really great things in this area. Specifically in creating this passion within the church to engage in overseas missions and to take the gospel to the nations. So we see courses like Perspectives and organizations like the Center for Mission Mobilization and the Go Center here, really working to educate and equip people and to emphasize this go command of the Great Commission, that we literally have to go to them. So for TJ and I, we took the Perspectives course 4 years ago now, and it really did instill in us this deep desire to go to the nations and to be around the poor and to be an active part in the Great Commission. But as we started praying about it, the reality was we were here in Fayetteville. We were young and newly married, and we had also received this advice that before you go overseas, can you do it here, in the context that you live in a culture that you're familiar with, when you're surrounded by family and friends? Can you do it here first? And so we really took that to heart and started thinking about it. And led us to ask these questions, okay? How do we do it here? How do we advance the kingdom of God here in Fayetteville? How do we engage with the poor and the marginalized here in our city? We really had no idea where to start, and we felt really, really stuck. These felt like big, unattainable questions. So I mentioned earlier that I work for Join, and because of that, TJ and I knew all about what the Murrays were doing over in India. They were engaging this small community in northern India through these businesses that they had started. One was Join, and then another one was Dehradun Guitar Company, building guitars. So we decided, okay, the next step, we're going to go visit the Murrays in India and learn from them, see what they're doing. Maybe we can learn something that we can apply here in Fayetteville. So in terms of learning and exposure, it was phenomenal. I mean, we got to see the poor, we saw the disabled, we ran into the street kids begging for money. Mel took us to the leper colony. It's a co-op that they partner with to actually spin the fabric that's used for the bags and scarves that Join puts out. And that just blew my mind, being around lepers. I didn't really even realize that was still a thing. It was like just something that existed in the Bible. But we got to be around them and get to know them and talk to them. We saw the slum communities around the Join headquarters. And we got to talk to the men and women who work for Join and hear their stories and hear about how Join has impacted their lives and the type of community they now have with the people that they work with. And we saw how the Murrays were daily engaging with these people in society. Mel talks about how she literally has people people come up and beg her for jobs every single day, and she sometimes has to turn them away because she doesn't even have enough jobs to provide. But they're there, they're surrounded by these people that we wanted to engage. And so we came home inspired. We were really excited, like, yes, we're going to do this. But we realized, like, almost immediately, literally driving home from the airport, we were like, oh yeah. And we had this unsettling realization. Where are the poor and the marginalized in our community? Like, we were driving down the road and we're like, wait, we don't see them. Pull into our neighborhood. Oh, they're not around here. We don't work with them. And so we had been surrounded by the poor and the marginalized in India, and we wanted to engage them like Mel and Dave were doing. But we were literally asking these questions now. Well, where are they? We didn't see them on a daily basis. So how do we then go find them? So this brings me to kind of the last point I want to cover for tonight. The concept of spatial separation. We realized that it was difficult to impact our local context in the kind of way that Mel and Dave were getting to do over in India, because we have spatially separated ourselves from the darkest places in our city. What this means is that our daily lives and interactions have become very distant from those who are strikingly different from us. So people that have different beliefs and values, people who act differently from us, and people who live in the parts of our city that we don't go to. So this idea of spatial separation is a major barrier when we're talking about impacting the city. So it means that we often don't live near them. We don't go to the places they go. We don't talk to them and hear their stories, hear what their life is like. And this physical distance acts as a barrier for us to understand and engage the poorest, most broken, and most oppressed people in our city. So there's a real barrier in place before we even try to go out and impact the city. So how is this to be overcome? We often think that the go command of the Great Commission means we have to go overseas, go to a foreign country. And sometimes it does. A lot of times it does. But I propose that as Christians living here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, that we can take this same go principle of the Great Commission applied overseas and apply it here to our city and engage our city by going. But what this means is that we have to intentionally go to places that we are currently separated from and look for people that we don't normally see and engage with groups and with people that we're often very unfamiliar with and often very uncomfortable with. So I'm talking about the homeless community, the mentally ill, the LGBT community, single mothers with children from a host of fathers, the dancers in the strip club and the men that go there very frequently. The buzzword or kind of phrase that I've heard a lot lately is, okay, as Christians, we just need to love people. We just need to love them, not judge them, we need to love them. But I think it's really hard to love people when we're not even where they are. We're not even in a physical proximity to them. And I know as much as we just wish they would come to us and come through the doors of our church and hear the gospel and be changed, the Great Commission calls us to go to them. So I want to finish tonight focusing on this question right here. Where are the people and places in our city that are most isolated from the gospel? And I want us to ponder this idea of spatial separation. I think it's the first step to answering this question of how do we engage with people? How do we impact our city? How do we engage in this cultural engagement? If it feels unsettling, it honestly is. I mean, it's talking about getting out of our comfort zone. It's talking about stepping out of the places that we normally go to. But at this point, to help facilitate with this is why we have the city engagement component, that we actually wanted to give you opportunities to step out and try this and see and get some exposure. But before we get into the city engagement, which I'm going to make TJ come up here and talk about, I want to spend a few minutes talking about this question. So let's take a few minutes, maybe 5 or so, and gather up with 3 to 4 people around you and talk about this. What are some people and places in our society that you've noticed maybe, or areas that maybe are really separated from the church doesn't have a presence in? Okay, so let's take a few minutes to do that.